Dear family members, dear friends, students, and all who are now the global community that Mala has created. Let me begin with an introduction. I'm Mary John, a friend of Mala's who works at the Center for Women's Development Studies in Delhi. A few of us, Nivedita Menon, Vasuki Nesaya, Riti Lukos, and I, along with the South Asian University and the support of Pradeep Jagannathan, have organized this event to redirect our grief and come to terms with Mala's passing. We are deeply grateful to all of those who have agreed to speak and share on this occasion. May I once again ask all of you to please mute yourselves at this time, and also to cut off your video screens to enable better sharing at this time. This event is but one way to bring us together in commemorating Mala's life and work. The isolation and suffering unleashed by the pandemic and lockdown has also made us turn to forms of virtual sharing when travel is still very restricted or not even possible. There are about 25 of us who will be sharing today in words or pictures. We are unable to include more since this program is already set to last for over 2 hours. Each person has been asked to speak for not more than 5 minutes and to only unmute themselves when it is their turn. From what I can see, almost 200 have joined us, and we welcome you all. Please bear with our fumblings and the glitches that we are bound to occur. We welcome your thoughts in the chat box. In fact, that would be one of the places where each of you could introduce yourselves, which is available alongside. This event is also being recorded, and in a few days, we hope to make the recording available to anyone who wishes to view it later. I first got to know Mala in 1996. In December of that year, some of us were involved in a conference on rethinking the third world, which was held in Kingston, Jamaica. Through her doctoral research on the Mother's Front in Sri Lanka, Mala forcefully conveyed a feminist perspective on the Civil War in a way I had never grasped before. She asked questions of our contemporary feminist world that my location in South India at the time had never demanded of me. Soon after that conference, I got a copy of her book, Embodied Violence, Conceptualizing Women's Sexuality in South Asia, co-edited with Kumari Jayawardena. This book was one of the very first to give concrete meaning to the term South Asia for me, and I felt grateful that it was feminists from Sri Lanka who had opened this reality to people like me. More than anything else, Mala embodied a politics of location in its fullest sense. This phrase is about the politics of accountability, how to be accountable to as third world academics to our own spaces under the hegemony of the first world without falling prey to nationalisms. Mala returned to Sri Lanka in order to be the kind of activist scholar that she was, answerable to people and to intellectual truth-telling. She came back to Sri Lanka after having spent her entire higher education from college onwards in the US, and without the kind of institutional home that at least Indian academia, despite its many problems, has provided to most of us in this country. I mourn Mala's passing along with all of you. Sharing in this grief through so many of her friends has given me solace too, as I have come to realize her extraordinary capacity to find meaning and purpose amidst ruins. Already in 1995, a quarter century ago, Kumari and Mala wrote in their preface to Embodied Violence about what it meant to conceive a volume, and I'm quoting, "In troubled times, in which fanaticism has a stranglehold on the subcontinent, times in which the everyday lives of innocent citizens have become fraught with fear and suspicion, hatred and violence." Despite this, or precisely because of this, their book went on to tell the stories of different kinds of women, some of whom are instruments of destruction, but also others who weep for their murdered loved ones and yet go on to protest marches. Mala was an inspiring example of how to go on living and resisting in dark times. And for this, I salute her. I would now request Sasanka Pereira, professor of the South Asian University here in Delhi, to say a few words. Please unmute yourself, Sasanka, so that you can speak.
I must confess that in the last decade or so, my personal contact with Malathi has not been very extensive compared to, I would say, a couple of decades before that. From that more distant past, I remember quite well having dinner with her and Pradeep in their first home, south of Colombo, meeting in innumerable public and private events in Colombo, including in my house, and once traveling to Kathmandu for a conference and having an overdose of momos, and on many other such moments. But as this contact reduced to a certain, what I would say, intermittent emails that mostly dealt with academic matters, I think I began to get to know her quite differently and perhaps much better through what she had written. The last time I met Malathi, even though again very briefly, was at a discussion of a book on the practices and institutional histories of sociology and anthropology in South Asia, which some of us had edited. We had invited her as one of the speakers when the book was introduced to readers in Colombo. She was partly and naturally very critical of our approach, which she thought was somewhat rhetorical. And of course, we readily agreed, since interventions of that kind needed to be somewhat noisy, as much as they were hopefully sensible as well. Later, I was supposed to have dinner with her in one of my irregular visits to Colombo, even though that did not happen, and I really can't remember why. My sense is one of us must have postponed it for some reason, but then we know this is how life unfolds, and we cannot always plan as we wish. Today, I simply want to make 2 points, one personal and the other intellectual. Both in my mind are related, and both has to do with thinking of Malathi and also thinking of the future. Personally, as some of us push well beyond half a century on this planet, and the world is getting steadily messier, I am constantly reminded that time is not something we should ever take for granted. But with COVID-19 as our latest collective inheritance, many of us, including myself, keep on postponing what we ideally should not. And this has its own repercussions, and often those repercussions are irreversible. And this brings me to my second point, the intellectual one. People like Malathi, myself, and many others generally traverse between two discursive worlds simultaneously as a matter of routine. That is, we mostly write and engage in our key intellectual pursuits in English across boundaries, speaking to the world, while we actually work in places where most routine conversations, regular life, and politics take place in languages other than English. So in real terms, this means Malathi's work is not as well known as it should be in Lanka itself. And this is clearly the case among young people working in Sinhala and Tamil. And this is my concern. I had asked her once long time ago whether she should not think about making her work available in at least one of the two local languages in the country. I think we were discussing how effective our own work was in our own countries because of this issue of language. But I never pursued that conversation. Like many other things in life, I had postponed it, as did Mala. That is a postponement I wish I had not done. I hope some of us would take this thought more seriously today than I did years ago, and consider today as a point of departure to let her memory live in what she has written, not only amongst ourselves who knew her in one way or another, but also among those who work in Sinhala and Tamil who do not know her yet. And if this makes sense to anyone, I am willing to help. Let me end with a Pali stanza from a Buddhist text on the reality of impermanence that has been drilled into me from a very young age, which I also think Mala would have heard many times in her work and life in Lanka. And this is how it goes in English. All conditioned things are impermanent. Their nature is to arise and pass away. To live in harmony with this truth brings about the highest happiness. I wish Malathi a very long life in our memories. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasanka. I now ask Sonali Deraniyagala at Columbia University to share her thoughts with us.
Hello, everyone. Yeah. I'm speaking from London, and I'm speaking as a friend. So this morning, I saw a heron here in London on a canal. It flew out of some reeds and it landed on a barge nearby. I would normally have taken a photo of this bird, and I would have sent it to Mala. It was just an ordinary grey heron, but Mala's reply would have lifted the gloom of these lockdown days. She would have seen sunlight hidden under that bird's raised wing. She would have noticed that the contours of its feathers fused with ripples on the water. She would have responded with such an excitement about the bird that it looked suddenly miraculous. But the winter air coming off the water felt icier this morning because I didn't have Mala to send my photo to. Mala and I were friends since we were both 7 years old. What made Mala really rare and beautiful was a quality that infused everything she did. Mala could find wonder and astonishment in the ordinary. She saw value in the small details of everyday life. And Mala really knew how to look at our world. She could do this better than anyone else I know. And looking was not something she did with her practiced eyes. She did it with her entire fine-tuned being. For me, this made Mala a vast, immense soul. Just as she could see the slant of light that made a heron magical, she could find some small suggestion in a human story that at once lifted it, gave it power. For Mala, every human story was worthy of attention. I remember one story she told me. It was about a woman she met when she was interviewing, doing research in northern Sri Lanka after the war. This woman had a scar across her face. Her jaw had been shattered by shellfire. And she told Mala how she'd spent many months in hospital in the south, having repeated surgeries, unable to speak, alone. And the nurses there often would express very loud pity about her muteness, but they never asked her anything about her life. And this woman told Mala how reduced she felt by this. And she remembered thinking to herself, there are worlds in my head these people will never know about. When I heard this, I felt Mala was the ideal person to now receive this story. From a scar on a jaw, she could release a world. And she could see a world in a layer of dust. This is another story. When she was researching memorialization, Mala interviewed a man whose wife and daughter had been killed in the tsunami. He had recently remarried, and his new wife sat with him as they talked. But soon as she left the room, he brought out an album, a photo album, and showed Mala photos of his family who had died. And even as he seemed relieved to do this, Mala noticed that the album was covered in dust. He hadn't looked at it for a long while. And in that thin film of dust, Mala understood a lot about memory, its many dimensions, and the limits to how much memory we can tolerate. It was this deep intelligence of the soul that Mala brought to the book she initiated and co-curated, Archive of Memory. It explores 70 years of independence in Sri Lanka, by gathering immense stories from small things. 70 individuals talk about an object they value, something simple, a pencil, a suitcase, and we are brought right up to national events. They come up close, variously horrifying, joyous, shameful. And these objects line up one after the other to form the most electrifying telling of Sri Lankan history. And my first memory of Mala also connects to an object. It was a wildlife documentary that her parents screened in their garden on her 7th birthday party, in their lush garden on School Lane. I was blown away. I had never seen a wildlife film before. I had barely seen a movie. Nature was, of course, a constant in Mala's life. Mala was a pilgrim of the wild. Its abundance, again, of tiny details nourished her. So often with our friends Carol and Marianne, we would linger for hours by a villu in Wilpattu, and Mala in rapture. No camera, just her own shutters open wide. And to us, it seemed like she could almost switch senses in the jungle, one sense doing the work of another. It's as though her eyes could hear a twig snap on a distant Lunavarna tree, or her ears could see an eagle blurred by cloud. After nature turned on me in 2004 and my family was taken in the tsunami, Mala was a constant in my life. She helped me find balance by taking me to wild places and empty landscapes. Mala was sensitive to our world because she loved it Sweden in the deepest winter. And love too is made up of small details. When she worked with those who had sorrow and pain, she gave back with acts of kindness and decency. And us, her friends, she loved with her generosity. She shared with us, invited us to share all that moved and thrilled her. We were blessed. Most days I would wake up to a message from Mala on my phone, and her messages elevated me, entertained me. And now, what a huge gap there is in our world. Thank you.
So I may now ask Indira Peterson, Emeritus Professor of Mount Holyoke College, to share her thoughts with us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This gathering is a testament to Mala's extraordinary life, to the extraordinary impact she has had on all whose lives she has touched. We're all here simply because we are privileged to be friends of Mala. Inspired by her, we have become stitchers of a quilt of many colors, painters of a beautiful kolam, those intricate geometric designs that South Asian women draw on their thresholds every day. I would like to share my screen with you. Bear with me while I do this. I'm not very good at it, but here we are. Sorry, I have to get to the very beginning of this. There we are. A quilt, a kolam, my mother and myself making a kolam together, a large collaborative kolam made by our aunts. Sorry, that's not what I want to do. Screen sharing, stop share. Okay. Our quilt kolam is a web of friendship, drawing sustenance from Mala's passionate vision, a vision in which ethics and aesthetics, learning and practice, the local and the global come together, with commitment to social and gender justice as its central concerns. Here are a few glimpses of my own journey as a friend of Mala. I first got to know Mala as a student advisee in Asian Studies at Mount Holyoke College, the pioneering women's college from which she graduated in 1985. It was a place where lasting bonds were forged. Mala became a beloved friend. A stellar student, of course, Mala thrived in a community of women, in the liberal arts curriculum, in our women's studies program in the heady days of its formation. But Mala taught us as much as we taught her. With their grids and squares, quilts and columns present barriers, but they also hint at pathways, and they keep growing in the creative hands of women. Mala has shown us borders are meant to be crossed, horizons expanded, new paths forged, preferably through collaboration and engagement. Thanks to her example, we have all learned to be better feminists, scholars, and true friends. I have avidly followed Mala's path-breaking career as a scholar, activist, and mentor par excellence, happy that in her husband Pradeep, she found a soulmate who shares her passion for engaged scholarship as well as for art and life. Mala returned to Mount Holyoke often. She last visited us in 2014 when I invited her to speak on her collaborative project on the worship of the goddess Patini Kannaki in Sri Lanka, performed across ethnic, communal, national, religious, and gender boundaries. The lecture accompanied an exhibition of Sharni Jayawardana's photographs. We stitched together so many threads of our quilt at that time. Kannaki, the goddess heroine of the classical Tamil epic, the Silappadiharam, the anklet, is worshipped as Patini in Sri Lanka. Mala had read the epic in translation for the first time in my course on Indian literature. But it took a Mala to connect that thread to popular rituals in Sri Lanka among communities that have been torn apart by a long and brutal civil war. And only Mala could illuminate with such insight how, dissolving the folk classical binary, persons of Tamil and Sinhala, Buddhist, Christian, and Hindu, female, male, and transgender identities create in the narratives and rituals of the goddess a personal, a community space. That space was for processing and healing the suffering and trauma of violence and war, and for forging justice. Here, as in her Archive of Memory project, Mala traces the intimate connections between memory, emotion, and material objects. Mala had a delightful sense of humor and passionately loved life, nature, people. She was a gourmet cook, an avid naturalist, an expert in the Sri Lankan flora and fauna. In 2017, when my husband Mark, also a professor at Mount Holyoke, and I made it to Sri Lanka at last, Mala curated an amazing tour for us, covering the country's natural beauty and its complex history. She treated us to a 7-course vegan gourmet meal, and we parted after a memorable evening at the Galle Face Hotel with other Sri Lankan alumni. How privileged we were to see Sri Lanka through Mala's wise, expert, and loving eyes. Here we are, and I will now go back to that screen. First, Mala, I have to double click and then make it into a bigger screen. There's Mala, myself and Mala at the exhibition at Mount Holyoke. Mala at the exhibition. Oops, it's not moving. There's Mala. There we are at Colombo. And here we are at Mala's in Sigiriya as evening falls, quietly watching water birds fluttering in the marshes, just as Sonali so beautifully described. But let me end with a classic Mala moment. Here we are at Mala's favorite juice bar in Galle, joyfully sipping the ginger cucumber smoothie that Mala told us that we had to drink. We sent her these photos to prove that we did. As we mourned Mala, Riti, another friend, fished out another photo, this one of Mala enjoying that same smoothie. That's what it takes to see like our beloved friend. Mala would want us to keep seeing, keep crossing borders, keep building the column, keep stitching the quilt, not as if everything depended on it, but because it does.
Thank you, Indira. May I now ask Farah Hanifa, University of Colombo, to share her thoughts? Or would you,
Okay, I'd just like to start by saying, Sasanka mentioned that Mala's work is not well known in Sri Lanka. So I'm just in the middle actually of reviewing some translations that were done by students of Sasanka's and one student of mine as well. Kaushalya Kumarasinghe and Anushka Khandagama have been translating some of Mala's works. And so motherhood as a space of protest and the feeding of the milk mothers, Kiriyamma Varun Gidane, I have been translated and I'm just reviewing them. So I thought that was something nice that we can think about in terms of Mala and how her work is getting better known in Colombo. Okay, let me just start now. So I have been in awe of both Mala's and Pradeep's work since I first met them as grad students back from Chicago decades ago when I had just completed A-levels. In the years that followed, when I went to Mount Holyoke and then to grad school in New York, conversations with Mala and Pradeep were important and significant. Struggling as a grad student in the US and later writing my dissertation alone while in Sri Lanka, I tried to emulate the depth, the rigor and beauty of their work. While I began teaching at Colombo, While I began teaching at Colombo, Mala continued to be a colleague as well as an intellectual sounding board. We taught together in the Women's Studies course at the Faculty of Graduate Studies. And as our current students will no doubt attest to, Mala took mentoring very seriously. She was constantly making connections for others and pushing us to do more. I met Kumari Jayawardena, my most significant mentor, and my dear friend Bina DiCosta through Mala, both times when Mala generously provided me with opportunities to work at the SSA in the late 1990s and to attend a conference in her stead at ANU in Canberra more recently. I remember how she supported me at moments of intellectual crisis, how she would have me over for coffee to discuss papers I was struggling with, and how she valued and provided validation of my work. I think the strongest memory I have of her is of her being an example of how to do more. Sri Lanka is a strange place in which to write. The demands of a university that is devoted primarily to undergraduate teaching means that knowledge production is often a lonely exercise. Intellectual community is to be found in strange places. For 10 years of my intellectual life, when I was raising 2 boys as well as being a teacher and an activist, I often wrote alone and at home. Maintaining an edge in my writing and inquiry was difficult. Mala was one person that I could depend on at a variety of levels. Our interactions were rare, but of great significance to me. As stated earlier, she and Pradeep were examples that I have always tried to emulate. But more recently, Mala has been important at pivotal moments. There were 2 particular instances where her help was invaluable. One time, a well-known Sri Lanka scholar located abroad ignored my work when writing about an area where I considered myself to be an expert in. Now, of course, I know that this is not unusual, and I know not to take myself so seriously that such incidents feel crippling. I know that they are common in an academic world run on funding deadlines and review processes. But my younger self struggled. Mala was sympathetic, as were many that I spoke to. However, Mala actively solicited a review opportunity with a prestigious journal and read drafts of my reviews. I ultimately did not publish it, but Mala's validation of my emotional and professional distress saved me from being scarred by this experience. That was one instance. In writing about Muslims in Sri Lanka, I constantly struggle against the liberal narrative of Muslim backwardness that prevails in discussions here. To date, when the government's egregious use of tropes of Muslim perfidy for political ends is so clear, we still have not worked out how to think about and write about Muslimness in the country outside of the readily available frames. We are still talking about good Muslims and bad Muslims, Sufis and Wahhabis, whether hijab is a choice and if the face veil is a security risk. I have struggled to find ways in which to posit my writing to interrogate these easy frames that everyone, even the most woke among us, are so uncritically familiar with. Everybody knows everything there is to know about Muslims after all. I wrote a paper a few years ago about the similarity in the misogynist rhetoric of the BBS monks, state representatives, and the responding Muslim male elite. It was to Mala that I went to for guidance on how to frame it. She recognized both my political project and the intellectual work that needed to be done to bring it to fruition. Of course, we didn't just talk about work. We also talked trash about people we knew, discussed our respective families and work lives. I didn't see or hang out with Mala as much as I would have liked to. But every time we did, it was fun, memorable, and important. And the manner in which she marked my intellectual life is only becoming clearer as I revisit the many interactions that we had over the years. Stop, thank you.
Thank you, Farah. May I now ask Maitri Jagadesan, Santa Clara University, to share her thoughts, please.
So thank you so much, Mary, Nivi, Viti, and Vasugi for organizing this gathering. It is incredibly warming to see so many of Mala's friends and loved ones coming together. I only came to know Mala in 2017 in person, but I had long known her work. And as a graduate student at Columbia and studying under her friend David Scott, I actually think I sent her an email, maybe scanning some documents for her. So a very quick passing and very intimidated at the time. So when we finally met in Colombo, she was serving as a discussant on a panel that I was on about Sri Lanka's rural landscapes. I was so nervous. Academia in the United States, where I studied and where I now teach, is designed to train us young brown women to fear and assume the worst. But as soon as Mala began reflecting on the panel's papers, her generosity cut through my fear. And what I realized was that I was witnessing a type of mentor that I wanted to share with my own students for the rest of my career. As she spoke about my paper, I scribbled furiously in my notebook in just 5 minutes. And I can't actually read some of the notes. I was scribbling so fast. And in just 5 minutes, her reflections managed to spill over containers of time and place. At one point, I stopped writing in my book and distinctly remember meeting her eyes with excitement over our shared love of the material objects and forms that she was describing, and the possibilities of what they might tell us if we watched them for their incapacities to stay still. That was what Mala did. She did not just look at objects or materials, she watched them. Mala's ability to place different histories and textures, voices, and stories alongside one another was not just one of her passions, but a broader feminist method and praxis of disruption, an expansion that I found and continue to seek refuge in as a scholar. That year, she suggested that I meet the Malaya Tamil artist, Hanusha Somasundaram, who I would later interview and whose art is featured in my book, and whose art we see in Archive of Memory. Whenever I see Hanusha's art and its disruptions on Sri Lanka's hill country, I think of you, Mala. When we last saw each other in 2019, it was in her home, and she was doing one of the things she loved to do most, which I would come to learn, to cook. She had casually mentioned to me, and I had to look back at the Facebook Messenger messages. She said, "Come for a simple lunch at noon." And what I came to was, in fact, not a simple lunch, as many of you may know, but in fact, a 7-course meal, complete with a cardstock printed menu with my name on it. And I had just had surgery, and in my own process a couple months before, and in my own process, I was finding cooking and preparing food particularly healing, but she didn't know that. And so this was so special in terms of how she had prepared this, and we were sharing this meal. I have to say, I had honestly, and I told her this in a message later, I have never been given a meal like this. And I don't think I ever have since then. And now in these times when many of us cannot share meals with the people that we love and hold dear, I think back to her simple gesture, but it was not so simple, of cooking, sharing, and setting a meal for two, and how precious that was. I do not know how to put into words what her scholarship and presence has meant to me as a feminist anthropologist located outside Sri Lanka, but thinking with communities in Sri Lanka. Her scholarship and words have spoken to me in the most dark and insecure of times, whispering to me that this place academia builds needs not be lonely. It needs not be a boys' club. And in fact, it can be a space driven by an ethics to unearth the tensions, desires, and relationships that we often all know, but cannot find the words and sometimes the strength or resources to describe. Mala has found those words and that strength, and I and so many others continue to learn from her writing, our memories of how we engaged with her in person, and how as we continue to envision more liberating spaces in which we can think together. I learned through her voice that this place need not be a silo, but can spill into the worlds we inhabit, endlessly connecting and listening to what matters most and doing what matters most. I saw that in the last email exchange we had in July last year, when she was collecting funds to support the scholarships for women from Eastern Province to study at American University of Women. Mala, for the brief times we had together, I am grateful to continue to learn from you. I know you are with us all today, and that your words will continue to disrupt and that they will refuse to stay still. Thank you.
Hello, Geetika from Cornell University, Geetika Dharmasinghe. Please share your thoughts with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm proud that I get to share my thoughts on Malathi, though I really wish I did not have to commemorate her this early. I want to talk about how I felt about Malathi in the years I was lucky to know her, and how I will remember her for the rest of my life. For me, the beauty about her is that she was the first woman in Sri Lankan politics after Kumari Jayawardena to build our thinking on the role of women and of her traditional position by uniting academic and political practices. I will focus here on what, by my understanding, is the largest contribution to that end. In our political spaces, I always cite and discuss her work on the NGOization of the political sphere after the 90s in Sri Lanka. Her main thesis on this subject is that the oppositional politics, for instance, campaigns in the early 1980s, gradually became dispersed and fragmented, what she characterizes as a shift from strategies of refusal to strategies of request. Organization from the South and the North, like the Mothers Front, that organized around the mid-1980s in the context of civil war to counter the militarization and extremist nationalism, diluted to projects and programs focused on, for instance, women's empowerment, gender sensitization, and campaigns to change legislation to increase women political participation, and many more. She suggests that while feminism has been institutionalized and professionalized, feminist activism has become a full-time job. One can now find employment as a full-time feminist. In other words, it is a story of ways in which feminist politics has become limited and produced new comfort zones. Their strategies are not forms or non-cooperation anymore, such as strikes, fast, go-slows, and other forms of civil disobedience, but have shifted towards making demands through legal reforms, lobbying, signature campaigns, charters, or email petitions. Oppositional politics have turned into forms of virtual resistance, as Arundhati Roy aptly put it. Hence, she claims that their politics has failed to refuse to acknowledge the pre-given framings of the state or the militants, where in fact the very parameters of the political and identities are put into question. In short, no more insurrectionary politics, rather everyone requests reforms. Malathi has produced a wealth of research and publications. I have not seen a thinker like Malathi who produces brilliant theoretical arguments with research evidence in less than 20 pages. Malathi was an active member of Women for Peace in 1984. She told me that they were criticized and labeled by many from the South as Colombo elite women who seek to divide the country by advocating the devolution of state power as a solution to the ethnic conflict of the island. When I interviewed her in 2012 on her work and politics for the Rawe newspaper, I asked her whether her politics was restricted to the Colombo English-speaking crowd only. She said that she engaged in politics to prevent that criticism, and that teaching at Colombo University is not only academic, but also a political attempt. One of the other frequent places that I met her, except her house, are the places of struggle that we organized. She came to protest that I was part of. She had a brilliant skill of sharing a lot with few words. When I went to see them, Malathi and her husband, Pradeep Jagannathan, one of my mentors, our conversations lasted many hours. They were full of witty jokes, criticisms, and intelligence that always broadened my thinking. So I don't have much more to ask from her, though the pain would have been much less if she didn't leave us so early. When I got to know that she was sick, I felt wretched, my heart broken. She left me many things when she was alive, but also when she left, a lesson that I must surround myself with people who will love me the day I die as much as I loved her. She was such a beautiful human being.
Thank you, Geetika. Riti, will you now take things forward? Thank you,
yes,
Riti.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Riti Lukose, and I teach at New York University in the US. I first met Mala along with Pradeep in 1996 when she and I were writing our dissertations in anthropology at the University of Chicago. The years we spent at Chicago was the beginnings of a deep and abiding friendship, intellectual, political, and personal, that has truly been one of the anchors of my life. In the Chicago of the 1990s, it was not easy being a woman from Sri Lanka, let alone a radically committed feminist scholar, which Mala was in the process of becoming. Chicago was intellectually heady, tough, competitive, and exclusionary when it came to matters of feminism and politics. As with everything she did, Mala resolutely followed her own path, engaging Chicago through her political location as a feminist. And what this has always meant for Mala is creating intellectual and political community through friendship, not just for the sake of thinking and strategizing, but for surviving and simply making it through with one's passions and commitments intact. She did this when she helped to co-found 2 organizations while at Chicago, Shakti, a study and action group, and Women for Peace. It was Mala who drew me into the Gender and Society workshop, the only space on campus for feminist engagements. She was able to navigate Chicago by finding mentors like Jean Komaroff, Lauren Berlant, and the few examples of politicized, engaged scholars she could find. The late Sharon Stevens in the anthropology department, and very importantly for Mala, Norma Fields, a scholar of Japanese literature, whose leftist feminist engagements and anti-nuclear activism resonated with the formative and grounding example of the engaged feminist scholar that Mala came to Chicago with, namely Kumari Jayawardena, who was also on her dissertation committee. As Mala moved on, she carried her engagements with anthropology with her, though she was never circumscribed or contained by it. I have often thought that the anthropological was a way for Mala to bridge 2 things that were deeply important to her, her aesthetic sensibilities and her political commitments. For she came to Chicago not only a feminist, but also a poet. The terrain of the cultural, for lack of a better word, was the terrain of her interventions, the source material for her thinking politically. There is the embodied practices of lamentation, tears, and curses in the public protest of the Mothers' Front, taking up a central topic of the anthropology of Sri Lanka, the worship of Patani Kanagi in invoking the goddess, collecting the poetry of women across communities in the aftermath of the war, or in the attention to everyday objects, narrative, and storytelling that animates the Archives of Memory project. Her feminism transformed these cultural objects into sites for rich, nuanced reflections on suffering and political possibility. But her anthropological sensibilities also produced a distinctive kind of feminism, not only focused on the law or the state or development, all of which she also addressed in different ways, but to my mind, distinctively anchored in an aesthetic anthropological orientation towards the cultural. Many people have written beautiful tributes to Mala, writing about her kindness, her generosity, that feeling one got of being uniquely seen by her. As Simone Weil has said, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And I think these tributes beautifully capture the impact of the sustained quality of her attention through which Mala's generosity flowed. Why and how did that kindness and that generosity never seem to deplete her, take her away from herself? How did all that kindness and generosity return her to herself? She passionately loved the things she liked, her favorite chili mango snack from Trader Joe's, this kind of mushroom ravioli, that kind of cheese, cherries from Washington State, all of which I have snuck through Colombo Airport at various times. In turn, visiting Mala in Sri Lanka was a trip through Mala's Sri Lanka, of course, meticulously planned. When my daughter Anju and I landed in Colombo, we were handed a day-by-day 2-week itinerary where everything was woven together. Food, views, breaks, reaching a particular destination at the exact time when one should see something in a particular light. It was an astonishing generosity that was never selfless. It was full of Mala. There is a song titled "Throw It Away" by the great jazz singer and songwriter Abby Lincoln. In it, she sings these words: "There's a hand to rock the cradle, a hand to help us stand, with a gentle kind of motion as it moves across the land. And the hands unclenched and open, gifts of life and love it brings. So keep your hands wide open if you're needing anything. Throw it away, throw it away. Give your love, live your life each and every day. And keep your hand wide open and let the sun shine through, because you can never lose a thing if it belongs to you. There's a natural obligation to what we own and claim, possessing and belonging to, acknowledging a name. So keep your hand wide open if you're needing love today. Keep your hand wide open and let the sun shine through, because you can never lose a thing if it belongs to you." Mala understood what this song expresses more than anyone that I know. She always belonged to herself. While she trod this earth, her hands wide open, letting the sun shine through, throwing it all away generously and lovingly, which might explain why I have been endlessly listening to this song since she died. Thank you. I would now like to invite Chulni Kodakara from the University of Edinburgh to speak.
Thank you, Vasuki, Nivedita, Mary, and Riti, for the opportunity to be here and to mourn and remember Mala with you, with Pradeep, and all the others here. So I'm going to speak to the significance of Mala's work as well as have others before me, because she hugely influenced so many of us and inspired more than one generation of scholars and activists in Sri Lanka. When I think of her work, I feel as if she arrived on the scene of academic scholarship at a really critical time in the history of this country, just after the ethnic conflict had been militarized and before the Second Southern Insurrection and the mass disappearances that occurred in the South. And her work on Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, on making of bourgeois female morality and respectability, and on maternalism, feminism, and political mobilization responded to that moment in history, both as an academic and as an activist. While she drew on Kumari Jayawardena's work and Indian scholarship on nationalism, she built on this work in her unique and insightful way, drawing on history and ethnography, on posters, letters, cartoons, and newspapers, articles, and even on conversations with three-wheel drivers. I think with the exception of Serena Tennecoon, whose life was also tragically cut short in 1989, no one else till then had unpicked the nation quite like Malathi did to reveal how central women were both to nationalist anxieties and fantasies. And the themes that preoccupied in her early work would become lifelong themes for her that continued to preoccupy her over the years. So what is also really powerful about her work is the way she returns to these themes over and over again, building on or revising her old analysis or taking them in a slightly different direction, like her more recent work on memory and monuments. But yet her old work never feels dated. More than 20 years later, her PhD on the Mother's Front, as well as her other early writings, still informs and still resonates in startling and powerful ways. There is another aspect to her enduring legacy, which is perhaps a little bit more awkward to talk about, but which I think is still important to remember. And that is her willingness to turn her ethnographer's eye towards her own political activism. This desire to put herself under scrutiny, I think, came out of questions that she grappled with relating to the relationship between feminism and anthropology, concerns about whether you can speak from within the domain of feminist politics rather than about it, and how anthropologists who are also feminists can frame research questions about political struggles in which they actively participate and intervene. What comes out of that self-reflexivity is a really powerful critique of women's organizing and strategizing in Sri Lanka, and as Geetika already mentioned, NGOization. Of course, she would later recognize that this might not have been appreciated by the wider community of activists. In fact, she later wrote that such criticism would be perceived as a form of disloyalty and breaking of ranks and a form of knee-jerk NGO bashing. But she was always really clear that her concern was that we were losing our control, critical and radical edge. So in the last 10 years or so, she consistently called for a feminist activism with an alternative vision, which questions and engages the political in a different way. In the wake of her work with the Mother's Front, she believed that grief, injury, and suffering of communities across the ethnic divide can provide the ground for such an alternative politics, particularly in a context where Sinhala Buddhist nationalism was always tried to erase the suffering. But she also came to recognize, and I quote, that political communities of the suffering do not and cannot spring forth spontaneously and naturally. They must be made, end of quote. And even though she believed that this might be too utopian a proposition, she was also of the view that for those who have tried all else and failed, it is such utopian reconceptualizations and reformulations which sustain an optimism of the will. So when I think of her work, I think of her searing analysis and critique, but also of this vision that she left us with of how things might be otherwise. And as we honor her memory, it is this vision that she left us with that I want to leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you, Chulani. I would now like to ask Jennifer Hindman from York University in Canada to share her thoughts with us.
Hi, everyone. This is a letter that I wrote to Mala as my tribute. My dear friend, I just reread our most recent WhatsApp thread before this celebration of your life and work. I cannot quite believe you won't be writing back. I finally get to meet so many of your friends and colleagues from over the years whom you've spoken about, but for all the wrong reasons. I also see your sisters, niece, and nephew on this call, but let me ask after them in a moment. You and I met, along with many others on this call, Maya and Nilufar and Alison Crosby, in the mid-1990s, like it sounds like many of us did as graduate students in Toronto, first of all. And we were part of a project that Leona Giles started called Women in Conflict Zones. And I was in Vancouver, you in Chicago. Of course, people were spread across the world, and makes this particular remembrance so special. I think you would be pleased. But I remember asking you if you'd be interested in doing a small research project on gender funded through Oxfam, and it was on gender and conflict. And I wanted to learn more about Sri Lanka and the competing nationalisms and how those were working out in Sri Lanka. And you said you were open to engaging the politicized landscape of humanitarian response. So in 1999, on our little budget, we managed to get 3 years of work out of a grant meant to last 3 months from Oxfam. It never really ended. We got new projects, or we made new projects up so that we could continue to work together in a very roughshod way. We deconstructed, not our work, but just to say so quickly, we tried to deconstruct the gender and development discourse. We destabilized the humanitarian project. We tried to do concrete things like generate strong ties to the community groups in the North and the East particularly. And I remember one of your favorite stops was Surya in Batticaloa, where the vividly purple three-wheeler was always parked outside. And we met, I think, Viji Murugaya there. She is on the call today from Toronto, I believe. But serendipitously, we created this binational method, a kind of, early transnational feminist approach, not at all new, but, in the 90s, and for us, it was new. We were research partners. We did everything together, absolutely everything. And while this might be quite standard now, it kind of unsettled the usual apartheid of the humanitarian industry, if you like, at the time, where the expats would interact with the expats and the Sri Lankan leaders would interact with their networks, and the two didn't meet often, but we would go to all the interviews with each other, and one of us would often get invisibilized. It was funny, but it was also important. And the notion of Dr. Malathi you became such a remembered name on our journeys. The laughs and stories at the end of the day keep me going now, which has been such a hard time. There was the rat who ate our bring your own pineapple at Club Oceanic in Trinco. The hotel wasn't even open during the intense part of the conflict in 2000 and 2001, but you asked if they would open for us, and they did. You enthusiastically jumped into the pool only to find it full of maggots, which I know is just one of those things we continue to talk about, for the 2 decades that followed the incident. There was the stubborn jellyfish that wouldn't get off your leg in Trinco as well. I don't know, Trinco seems to have been a bad spot, but you made our grant go so far by getting us a free place to stay at the community center in Akaraipatu. Unfortunately, the mozzie nets that I brought with me from Canada were designed for the Rocky Mountains and not for sleeping in the sweltering second floor of that community center with very little circulation. But as we got a bit older and wiser, you introduced me, as Riti and others have mentioned, to Kandalema, Wilpatu, and so many other gorgeous spots and places where we could debrief from these research journeys. The war was pretty fierce in those days, and Pradeep has written about the checkpoints, and I remember you getting us out of a number of tight spots, the checkpoints included. One day we were going down to that beach restaurant you loved so much with the shellfish and the seafood. My parents were actually with us, and the photo of Mala and her beautiful sisters, Sveni and Nilanti, in the background. I just wanted to mention how important that holiday was to my family and to my parents. But I just want to really make a couple of notes about how your entire family adopted me over the years, and I'm moved beyond words. I just want to say to Sveni and Nilanti and Chandana and Roni and Auntie Indrani and Uncle Gerald. I know Shamani and Shahen are on the call, but I just can't really put words to it. You made Sri Lanka my second home, not the country, not the nation, the nations that make up the country, but your home became mine, and I am so grateful for that. The work we did, I think, was really gravy, as my brother would say. It was not seemingly the point of our excursions and the deep friendship that we forged. We kept on moving, learning, revisiting the sites and people we had come to know over the years. Our week together in Sri Lanka during December 2018 was precious, with no pretense of work. And I'm so glad that we got to hang out at Peter and Winona's house in Toronto in 2019. I've struggled a lot through the last couple of years. It's been a tricky time, and your unconditional love and support has meant everything to me. We never got enough time together, but we always made the most of it. And I miss you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. I would now like to ask Amara Hapwarachi, a friend of Mala from Sri Lanka, to speak. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Amara, and I'm from Batticaloa, and I'm so thankful to get this opportunity to speak. I just wanted to share what a wonderful person, a human being she was, and like the kind of vibration she had. Like, so our connection to Malathi from Batticaloa, from the Batti women, dates back to over 20 years. So she made the first connection. I think she got to know that we were connected to a lot of women who were affected by the war and the violence, and she may have heard about us, and she connected with us. And it may have been for a research purpose or something like that. But just to let you know that she made this connection in the 90s, and she turned this connection into a friendship, and that friendship, right to the end, she was in connection with us. So that was the beauty, because we had a lot of people coming to Batticaloa, researchers, scholars coming to Batticaloa, but it was these very few people that kept that connection and made that connection into a friendship. And she not only connected with us as just us, but she connected with our family. She invited us to, whenever she used to come to Batticaloa, she would invite us to a meal. When we go to Colombo, she would somehow try to connect with us. So I'd like to share also, especially the two women from Batticaloa, Viji Murugai, I think Jennifer mentioned her. And so she had to flee Sri Lanka. So she's right now living in Canada. And Viji shared with me how many times, whenever she visits Canada, how she will always come and have long chats with her. And she also organized a research for her together, I think, with Jennifer, to come to Sri Lanka and do a research. And so Viji is so grateful for that. And then I would also like to share with you a story of Jayanti Thalesingham. She's also now living in France. And Jayanti told me that she used this phrase when she spoke about Malathi. She said, Jayanti said Malathi was born rich. And I asked Jayanti, what do you mean when she said born rich? So then she told me, Amaraka, it's like this. She didn't consider whether we are, she was so educated, but she never bothered whether we were educated or not. She used to sit and listen to our stories. So Jayanti said she shared with her how during the war, they had a bag prepared with all the documents, and whenever they had to flee, they take this call it a urea bag. Then she said there was during the 2006 period when the war started, people used to carry, there were stories that people used to carry mamatees. So then she found that these mamatees were carried to bury their dead. So she had written a poem. Malathi was so interested, she took the poem, took it to Colombo. Then I think she shared it with Pradeep's mother and got it translated, and then she put it into a magazine. So she was really connected so personally. Then I would like to also share a story from another friend. I think she must have been one of the last two master's students, Kartika. And Kartika shared with me, she said, with Malathi, she was my teacher, but she was so connected to my life, personally. And she said she always included me in the student body. because I used to travel from Batikalo. And she said it was like a healing. Being with Malathi was like healing for me, she said. And she said like my thesis, she used to kind of delve into, like, try to get the thesis from, like, delve into my interest area and write the thesis from that point to get the topic. So that personal connection. Then finally, just I would like to also mention, very important, because she also connected with, there was the American Mission, Marlene and Darshan. She was very connected to them here in Vatican. What happened was they help a lot of students who don't have higher education opportunities. So they were sending these students to Bangladesh. But then because of the corona, the scholarships were canceled, and Marilyn sort of reached out to so many friends. And Malathi, this is just the time that she had cancer, but Malathi wrote 80 emails, got 3 full scholarships, and one fourth scholarship she and her friends got together. And she, just when she realized that she may not live longer, she then connected with Marlene and told Marlene the fund will continue through Pradeep even when I move on. And I would also like to mention how much the way she was so vibrant, and she was vibrant in death, because the way she faced death, so I would like to make a special mention, because it was a time when we were feeling so fearful about corona, and then also we had a change in government. But she gave us so much courage from the way she faced death. And so I just like to mention that. So she was a wonderful person. And I'm so happy that you gave me this opportunity. So I think this is the little thing I could do for Malathi to share what she was like for us. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Nivedita Menon, and I teach at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. I have known Mala since 1994, when I met Mala and Prateep at the Subaltern Studies Conference in Colombo. And ever since then, she's been a part of my heart, which is essentially more than, well, at least half my life. I do want to express my sympathies to Mala's parents and her sisters, whom I've met and whose generosity I've experienced. I also want you to know that my own mother, who met Mala last time she was in Delhi, Mala quizzed her intensely on Kannagi. And my mother remembered that this morning, and she, as a mother, wanted me to convey my love and sympathies to Mala's parents. Mala was an artist when it came to friendship. I think that has become very evident over the things that have been said, but we all have experienced the way in which she curated every single friendship of the many, many friendships she had all over the world. She curated each friendship, each relationship with such intensity, with such loving kindness, with such a fine sense of aesthetics. And we know, each of us, and many of us outside this meeting, know what it is to be touched by Mala's grace. Mala was my companion in a larger feminist journey of solidarity that leapt over the barbed wire borders of our countries. She spurred my intellectual excursions with her own critical gaze on the nation state. We mourned together the tragedies that history wreaked in our part of the world, and we continued to hope and work towards justice and peace with thousands of others who were our fellow travelers. That room in my heart is always hers, and because she lived in so many hearts and in so many spaces where her courage and ethical vision left their mark, she will continue to be in this universe, free now, and part of everything we do and think and act upon. Because, in the words of Wisława Szymborska, death always arrives by that very moment too late. In vain it tugs at the knob of the invisible door. As far as you've come cannot be undone. Mala knew how to live and laugh and love with all of her heart. She had the courage to take emotional risks, political risks. She leaves behind an intellectual legacy, a feminist legacy of struggle, a legacy of lessons in friendship. As far as she came, cannot be undone. I woke this morning wondering what sort of bird Mala would have liked to be if she were not human. Why did I never ask her this question? Facing the monumental and irreplaceable loss of Mala's going, suddenly it felt like this was the one question that could have saved me now. Had I but known what sort of bird she wanted to be, maybe I could have made some meaning of my grief. And then I could see her laughing at me for this idiocy, her full-throated laugh, her beautiful wide smile. And I thought, she's in every bird I see and every bird song I hear. I call upon Nighat Saeed Khan, a socialist feminist activist and teacher based in Lahore, Pakistan.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about Mala. I think I can only second what all of you have shared so far. Mala's contribution for a feminist understanding of nationalism, militarization, and different aspects of feminism, the understanding of war, conflict, and women has been of particular importance for me as I grapple with similar questions, but without Mala's scholarship. I was also struck by her work on interrogating the political feminist peace activism in Sri Lanka. As I think back on the years of our friendship, I think not so much of Mala's scholarship, but of fun times, especially in the early years of our knowing each other. Mala could laugh often at me. During the 1990s and up to I think 96, we met frequently. The first time we met was in 1992. Kumari Jadavardhan organized a South Asian feminist conference on women, on issues of identity, ideology, and the state. Invited to this conference were feminists from my generation, all of whom knew each other and were friends. The only ones new to us were the presenters of the last panel, young Sri Lankan academics who were still pursuing their postgraduate studies. That panel was mesmerizing. Mala's fascinating paper on sexuality in the field of vision, the discursive clothing of the Sigiriya frescoes. She discussed the bare-breasted women at Sigiriya and how they gradually became acceptable to Sri Lankan nationalism. The frescoes, as is now well known, are the only examples of open sexuality in Sri Lankan painting. Omar Chakravarti and myself were determined that we must go and see the frescoes immediately after the conference, and we cornered Mala and Pradeep to take us. They laughingly agreed and we decided we would set off for Anuradhapura the day the conference ended, and with one day or the full day devoted to Sigiriya. Mala and I immediately warmed to each other during the conference. She insisted that instead of spending intense hours discussing our presentations and the ideas produced during the conference, that we, Malia, Kumudati, Samuel, and myself, should spend our time at the pool. The problem was that neither Kumi nor myself had taken our swimming costumes. Mala still insisted we get into the pool. Rolling up my pajamas and tucking in my t-shirt, I jumped into the pool only to be dragged under by my clothes, which were then ballooned with water. Mala was quick to grab my collar and yank me up, and we laughed. This laughter and teasing each other remained a part of our friendship. It was a longish journey to Anuradhapura, and I was in the company of 3 authorities of ancient India and Sri Lanka, all of whom talked intensely throughout the journey. I felt like a student listening to an amazing history lesson. I couldn't have asked for better company. But then, after lunch at a wonderfully quaint hotel in Anuradhapura, we went to Sigiriya. I couldn't believe it. Were we meant to climb this rock? Was I meant to do it? Was I meant to do it? I did, finally, protesting, huffing and puffing, pushed and pulled by Umar, Mala, and Pradeep, with each teasing me that my life was now in their hands. There is no way to describe the frescoes, and no way to describe how fortunate Uma and I felt to have Mala showing us what she had discussed in her paper. We were enthralled by them and almost equally by the graffiti that adorned them. Over 1992 and 1996, Mala and I met several times and spent time with each other frequently. The Institute of Women's Studies, Lahore, which I was associated with, wanted to discuss feminist studies and how to put together a postgraduate women's studies program. Our institute then invited Mala to be a part of the Asian Pacific pre-Beijing conference in Manila in 1993. Mala and I hit the pool again this time, but I had anticipated her and taken my swimming costume. No laughter then other than water fights. We followed this up with an 8-day workshop of regional feminism and the women's movement also held in Manila. Our resources were limited, but we managed to get permission to have the workshop and accommodation in a monastery. God watched down on us as we set about dismantling nationalism, militarism, the state, and religion. And we laughed at how incongruous our situation was and our surroundings when we in a monastery were dismantling the monastery itself. In 1995, we invited Mala for a national conference in Lahore. By this time, she had become friends with almost all my friends. I recall discussing the women's movement with her, especially since my own presentation in that conference had focused on what I saw as the stages of the movement in Pakistan. The period of demanding equal citizenship rights, to a period of confrontation with the state, and then the period we were in at that point, which was negotiation, public-private partnership, and working from within to reform the system. We met in New York on one occasion when she was at the New School in New York, and only periodically after that in Colombo when she was with ISIS. We reached out to each other to discuss her work on women's peace movement in Sri Lanka, but when argued that when we both argued, took the position that the feminist projects cannot be actualized without interrogating the state. Donor-funded projects and programs with diluted agendas and outcomes had only cursory impact on the elephant in the room. I couldn't agree with Mala more when I saw her paper, which other than just wording it somewhat differently, she said pretty much the same thing that I was saying, or she had seeded. She was looking at the peace movement, I was looking at the women's movement generally. When Mala passed away, I dug up old photographs of her in those workshops. In each workshop, Mala is laughing. That is how I would like to remember her. That laughter, which had nothing to do with academics, nothing to do with our intellectualism, but the sheer joy of throwing our head back and laughing. Rest in peace, Mala, and rest knowing that you have a lot in the globe who will carry you with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigat. May I request you to mute yourself? And Dina Siddiqui from New York University is next.
Hello, should I go?
Yes, Dina, you can be heard.
All right, thank you. I met Mala many, many years ago in Chicago at the I House, I think. Through Pradeep, I think we were both graduate students. So it's been a long time. And I thought I knew her, but the more I learn of her life, especially after she moved to Sri Lanka, the more I am in awe of her. She was a model for so many of us who wanted to live the politics of location and accountability that we wrote and taught about, who did not want to follow the conventional path of job and tenure in the US. She was a fellow feminist trained in the US, but teaching and working in South Asia, who showed us how to braid politics and scholarship, to do it effectively without being compromised, but with showing us how to navigate the challenges. And that's really how I remember Mala. That's how I think of her, not just as a dear friend, I have since moved back, but as a comrade in arms, emplaced in a particular South Asia. I think the one that Nighat and others have been talking about, one that South Asian feminists, activists across borders imagined into being in the 90s, in the mid 90s. I was at that 1992 conference that Nighat was just speaking about, and that's when I really got to know Mala intellectually. It was at a follow-up meeting organized by Sangat that I met her again properly. It was 2006. Fierce transnational feminist that she was, she kept us accountable. We were drafting on the side a statement on the 2006 invasion of Lebanon by Israel. Mala insisted we mention the Sri Lankan domestic workers who were trapped in Lebanon at the time. We had a huge debate over it, but as Mala reminded us, imperialism and feminist politics cannot be separated. Mala and I collaborated on writing a report for that conference, and I want to thank Kamla Haseen for sending me a copy, actually an image of the report, which has suddenly become so much more meaningful because I have very few photos with Mala, and that image of that report carries a lot of emotional valence. We've heard a lot about Mala's influence in Sri Lanka and in general in theories of nationalism and sexuality. I want to also say that she was a familiar figure in certain Bangladeshi academic circles. In fact, I had no idea she was so friends with so many of the Sri Lankans I know here. But my Bangladeshi friends were her close friends as well. She was regularly invited to speak at Dhaka University's Anthropology and Women's Studies departments. During these trips, Mala used these visits to familiarize herself with the memorial sites and spaces of Dhaka city. Our mutual friend, Professor Amina Mohsen, told me yesterday how much late night conversations with Mala, and Mala stayed with Aminappa, molded Amina's own thoughts on visual and gendered histories, on the place of women in visual narratives of the nation. And Aminappa is an international relations person, certainly hadn't thought about things this way. She also spoke movingly of the quiet solidarity and care Mala just produced wherever she went, carried within her. And somebody else, one of the speakers, mentioned how Mala turned connections to friendship. And I think that's exactly what happened with Aminappa too. And I think we all felt a little bit special that we had a special connection to Mala, but it turns out, she was so special. So many people had a particular connection. Fierce feminist, gentle friend. She has helped me, my loss of her has helped me reconnect with others. And my one regret is that I did not connect with her more regularly. I did really think we had time. In this season of death, Mala's leaving has been especially brutal, completely unacceptable. But I think she lives amongst us, not just through the brilliance of her scholarship or her activism and work, but also in the feminist communities of care that she cultivated so unassumingly and seemingly so effortlessly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. Kamla Haseen is a feminist activist and advisor to Sangat, a feminist network. Kamla?
Mala, are you here with us to feel the love so many of us have for you? Are you here to see our grief, our sense of loss, our collective mourning? Are you here, Mala, to hear us celebrate you, express our emotions, our admiration for you? Mala, for me, this question whether you are here is neither stupid nor childish. I believe, maybe not just believe, I know that we are not just bodies. We are also souls, and our souls do not die when we leave our bodies. Even if this is blind faith, I'm happy, Mala, that I have this faith because it makes it slightly easier for me to live with death, to accept death. Mala, at my age, about 75 now, I've seen many people leave their bodies. It's always painful, but it is much more painful when younger people than you leave. It is a much bigger loss, I think, when people like you, Sunila, Mito, my daughter, when you chaps leave, it's difficult. And Mala, what I remember most about you, and I'm so happy that everybody remembers like you, are your smiles. Actually, I cannot remember you without a broad, loving smile. I don't know whether you are ever serious. I remember and cherish your generosity, and so many of us have spoken about it. You always made time for friends and friendships. If you were in Colombo when I visited, in the last 35 years of our knowing each other, we always met. And normally we met at Kumari Jayawardhana's place. Together, three of us and Kumari's son, Rohan, we went to Hendala, the village outside Colombo. You swam there, and I can't swim, but I joined you in the pool. On one of those mornings from Hendala, you took me for a half-day bird watching tour on a boat. About 15 months ago, when I came to Colombo last, you came to our Sangat gathering. Mala, what I always admired about you was your closeness to NGOs and their on-ground work. You researched and wrote about that work. You recognized and valued grassroots work. You gave it meaning, Mala. You were this perfect combination of theory and practice, and that really made me admire you. I remember you, Mala, from that conference which Dina just spoke about in 2006. And I've been reading, going through this report, sending pictures of it, because Dina and you wrote it together. It's called Feminist Activism in the 21st Century. I also love and admire your South Asian and your global identity being. You are beyond borders, Mala. Along with celebrating you, Mala, I celebrate today our global feminist solidarity, so evident today, and our South Asian solidarity. I'm glad the South Asian University is with us today. Mala, because I love you, you'll remain with me. You've enriched my life, Mala. I salute you. Zindabad, Mala.
Thank you. Thank you, Kamla. I call upon Ratna Menon, who is a former student of Mala from New School, New York, who teaches writing at the Young India Fellowship Program at Ashoka University.
Thank you, Nidhi. I'm here today actually on behalf of my mother, Ritu Menon, who was supposed to speak, but is too scared of Zoom. So she has sent me something that she wanted me to read on her behalf, and then I will speak as me. This is my mother. There are so many ways in which we knew Mala, so many years of experiences shared. The friends we had in common, the books we read, the films we saw and wanted to see, the art shows we went to, and all the places we traveled to on wildlife trips, on art historical trips, and architectural trips, on semi-political ones, and on simply pleasure-seeking ones. In a way, I know Sri Lanka through Mala and Pradeep, saw it through their eyes, their deep love and knowledge of their country. Some years ago, a publisher friend of mine in South Africa gave me a book she had just published called The Search for the Rarest Bird in the World. I gave Mala a copy and she was completely blown away by it. I'd like to read a brief passage from it, not about the Ethiopian bird that the title refers to, but about another very rare bird, an island bird, the Mauritius parakeet. The author writes, I stood in an upland dwarf forest on the high mountain slope of the Black River Gorges National Park. The early dawn light reflected from the sea below, funneling clouds in silver ripples. Tiny white tropical birds fluttered above the valley floor like confetti against the canopy. This was the unforgettable Maccabee Forest. Then a screech ripped the sky above the trees. A long-tailed parakeet burst overhead, hurtling in a wide green tumbling circle as if a piece of the forest had become detached like a branch in the wind. Then it was gone. I had never seen such a green. It was the precious green of emerald, only rarer, less stereotyped and even more valuable, oddly translucent and three-dimensional, refracting light like a window opening onto a wild view. The Mauritius parakeet was, for a time, the world's most endangered bird. In 1986, fewer than 12 such birds lived free, only 3 of which were female. What flew above us that morning was true rareness. And my mother adds, I can see her now, my dearest friend, standing on a high hill, binoculars to her eyes, looking for the rare and the beautiful, the common and the unusual, all equally dear to her. I, Ratna, inherited Mala from my mother. This inheritance, one of my bounties of the South Asian feminist movement to which they both belong. I'm not sure, though, which of the following descriptions, while each technically accurate, best captures what she meant to me. She began nearly 30 years ago as my mother's friend and then mine, went on to become my MA teacher and then mentor, advocating on my behalf with administrators to give me the medical accommodations I needed to complete my degree. And I see that Ellen Freeberg is here today. She was Dean of Academic Affairs at the new school when I was there. And Ellen, I would like to thank you across all these years. And Mala sat by my side the night I frenetically wrote the last pages of my MA thesis. Only Mala would do that. And at some point along these years, she appointed herself my surrogate mother. While I never knew why she chose to do so, and certainly never felt worthy of the position, I unabashedly reveled in it. Our relationships with our parents can be deeply fraught, as Mala well knew about mine. So for me, her surrogacy was far from a cosmetic gesture. It was a characteristically generous and compassionate act which altered and enriched the conditions of my being in the world. This is not to say that she and I were constantly in touch, sharing ideas or even routine tribulations. That joy belonged to countless others, as the deluge of tributes testify. And that vast chunks of time passed between our own communication is a profound regret I must now live with. Regardless of how infrequently we communicated, however, Mala and I shared, as she said, an unspoken, unbreakable bond that kept me anchored in the world and that I treasured fiercely. Indeed, it was Mala's extraordinary gift that everyone she knew felt similarly anchored by her love. Maybe then this is the description which best captures it. Across the years and miles that bound and separated us, she meant the world to me. And I experience her passing as that of a parent. While cancer made her death expected, I am wholly unprepared for her loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratna. I'm Vasuki Nesaya, also a friend of Mala. And I want to speak first as a friend. As many have said already, Mala made friendship into a way of life, an act of living wisely and well, as someone said. Many of us who are here from Sri Lanka went to all-girls schools where we learned the art of friendship in ways that our schools engendered, but also in ways that they did not condone. As Mala's work on girls' schooling explained, these schools sought to interpolate girls into domesticity and the domain of respectability. Yet despite these ideologies, school took us outside of our familial roles, and the worlds of friendship forged there produced a different kind of freedom, a different way to live in the world through these horizontal connections. Friendships became a space outside of family life, sometimes adjacent to it, sometimes in touch with it. Mala and I went to the same school, but we were 5 years apart, so we didn't know each other at the time. However, friendship inhabited our lives in ways that were shaped by that same schoolyard, where girlfriends were core to what it meant to be a girl. Poring over Enid Blyton books about St. Clair's and Mallory Towers, school friendships that shaped our own sense of the camaraderie and secret worlds that friendship would forge. I first met Mala and became friends many years later. I'd already known Pradeep for many years from his time in Cambridge. But when I met Mala, we were both in graduate school, living lives in that shifting space between the US and Sri Lanka, where we found new homes in ICS and SSA, institutions and communities that were also spaces to forge friendships over politics and ideas. Discussions with others in that same shifting space, Kadri, and many more, but also with a range of elders, Kumari, Neelan, Charles Abesekara, Reggie Wardner. And as the elders went back to families and other responsibilities, our discussions spilled over into sleepovers at Mala and Pradeep's place in Mount Lavinia. And sometimes it was after stopping en route for drinks and dancing late into the night at the hut at Mount Lavinia Hotel. After that, we of course met every time I went back to home to Colombo, which was frequently, and every time Mala came to New York. I last met Mala for breakfast at the SSC Cafe on Maitland Place after she had had her morning swim. This was exactly a year to the day before Mala left us. Mala's generous and generative approach to friendship meant that being a friend meant that she opened the door to so many other friends. I became friends with Riti, Nivi, Sana, and many others gathered here through Mala. This expansive rhizome network of friendship is of course in keeping with Mala's academic work. Intellectual reciprocity and collaboration was central to her mode of academic intervention. I'm thinking here of the work she did with Kumari, Jennifer, Chulani, Hasani, Sharni, and many others, as people have already spoken to, as well as the connections she forged with her students, the dozens who have written on Facebook and elsewhere about how she mentored and bonded with them. This too was part of her collaborative ethos of academic life. In addition, the connections and associations between women were also, of course, the primary focus of so much of her academic work. Again and again, she asked questions about that work of solidarity and resistance amongst women. As widely noted, she did hugely influential work exploring the politics of solidarity and dissidence in movements like the Mothers' Front and Women for Peace, finding that mourning and resistance can be the glue for shared political presence, even across fraught lines of class and ethnicity. Then later, she explored the dynamics of such connections when feminist solidarities moved into the world of NGOs, professionalization, and the political economy of donor funding streams. Or as she put it in one of her essays, when it became tethered to a politics of request rather than refusal. Mala did not romanticize associations between women, but even her critique was charged by her recognition of her acute interdependence and a commitment to that latent transformative potential of such connections. A theme that is also captured in her more recent work on the symbolic connection between Patini and Kannahi and the women who found solace in these goddesses. Ultimately, from the generosity of her friendships to the politics of her scholarly interventions, Mala's life embodied a philosophy of profound social connection, of radical love, some might say. It is the kind of love that makes us, and in that sense, Mala lives on in all of us, in our friendships and our solidarities, in that expansive rhizome of networks, personal and political. However, the potent power of such love is that a loss also unmakes us. We will carry our loss of Mala with us always. This loss is now a part of who we are and of how we go forward. I can ask everyone to hide your video panel. I think it should see it at the top of your Zoom screen, that option. We are now going to see a video by T. Sanathanan, visual artist at the Department of Fine Arts at the University of Jaffna, and Sharni Jayawardena, photographer, documentary filmmaker, and co-curator of Mala of Invoking the Goddess, Pathinik Kanahi Amma.
அம்மை உளும்பினை எழுமிப்போ நல்லா கிளம்பூவித்த என் நாயகனா கோமிடத்தே கொல்லா கனவு கண்டே போரடி மாமியரே வாசமலர் பஞ்சனை மேவி மலரம்புயிலோ என் மன்னவனே ஓவியமே என்னுடைய நாயகமே உனக்கு மரநிழலோ வஞ்சுமைத்தை ஓதையுருமாமலர்கள் வேதியர்கள் ஓவிடவே உன்காதி கேட்டிடவே எங்காக நாயகரே உமக்கு தான் வஞ்சனையோ பத்தி வைத்த சித்திரமே வர்ணாஞ்சுகமே பாரப்பவுடைய பாவிகளே உங்கள் நனைந்த பாவிகளை வெட்டினரோ கத்தி கிளையானீரோ என் செல்வமே திபடிவே சேரும் இலற்றுமியே உன்னுடைய திட்டடியை காண்பதப்போ மானாகரன வளர்த்த என் வல்லி முறமாயோனே நல்லை நகர் மேலோனே நாங்கே வனத்தில் விட்டா போனானே மாதாத்தர் பெற்றெடுத்த என் மங்காற்றுடரொழியே மாதவியால் காதலனே நான் இங்கே பெரும் வெளியிலும் கேடானேனே கத்தி கிரையானீரோ என் செல்வமே திவடிவே சேரும் இலட்சுமியே உன்னுடைய திட்டடியை மண்ணில் குடமெடுத்தோ அஞ்சானீங்கள் மாதுளைக்கு வார்த்த தண்ணீர் அந்த மாதுளையும் வாரவில்லை அந்த மனைவி இங்கே வாடுகின்றேன். தாயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா தாயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா தாயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா. தாயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா தாயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா தாயே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா எங்களை பெற்ற நீரே ஊழிந்திடும் அம்மா.
Thank you. You can use the show video panel again. Now that we have finished that video, we'll have another one a little later on. Our next speaker is Hasini Haputantri, co-curator of the Archive of Memory with Mala.
Thank you, Vasuki, for inviting me. So exactly an year ago, on 25th February, Malathi and I launched the book Archive of Memory, the book that you just saw on the video. It was a project that we had been working on for about 2 years as co-curators, and it was about capturing the lived experiences of Sri Lankans in the last 70 years since it gained independence. And Malathi and I traveled together and separately as well, collecting around 300 stories and working together to select 70 of them, sifting through each and every single story and having long conversations, things I will remember definitely for a very long time. I'm just going to read one story that she wrote, she brought in. We were actually trying to find what is the story that we want to end this collection with, the last story. And we were searching for something special. And Malathi, in her wonderful way, came up with this beautiful story that she said is actually about her own ayah. And for me, it's that very special touch about Malathi, where she can turn anything into something very personal and meaningful and beautiful. So I'm just going to read that small story to you. And this is actually Malathi's ayah and Malathi's writing. It's called The Suitcase. I was born in April 1948, a few months after Sri Lanka gained independence. But as a person, I've never experienced independence in my life. I was 6 years old when my father died. My 11-year-old brother quit school to work in the paddy fields. I was sent to work on a relative's vegetable farm. One day, I accidentally pulled out all the chili plants, mistaking them for weeds. They beat me and sent me back. Then I looked after my 3 baby sisters while my mother too worked in the paddy fields. All my siblings can read and write, but I can't. I never got the chance to attend school. I joined this family as a domestic helper when I was 18. They were first stationed in Badulla, but my master was transferred to Colombo. I watched as my mistress buying this suitcase for me in Badulla market through a film of tears as I realized I was going far away from my family, but I had no choice. Colombo was another world. The ocean was so huge and unending. I loved going to the zoo and watching the elephants dancing and sitting on tiny chairs. I have also seen much ugliness, like in July 1983. I have listened to so many ambulance sirens at night during the Civil War, fearing they were rushing my brother's son, who was in the army, to the hospital. I knew the tsunami would come when several owls hooted all night on consecutive days. I've given away most of my belongings to my nephews and nieces, but I can't bear to part with this suitcase. It is now old and battered like me. It will not accompany me when I make my final journey, but it is comforting to know that it keeps vigil under my sick bed. I like to unpack and repack it when the rest of the house is asleep. R.M. Bandaramanika, Colombo, originally from Soranatota. So that was a story that Mala wrote for by herself regarding her ayah. And I'm just showing you some photographs of her and working with her in the launch where she was handing over those books to some of the people whom she really loved and connected and drew into a lovely project like that. So just wanted to, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Hasini. We'll next hear from Alison Crosby at York University in Canada.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for putting this event together and for inviting me to say a few words, which is such an honor and a privilege, but also so incredibly hard. Anything I could say feels completely inadequate in doing Mala's remarkable life and work justice, but I'll add a fragment to the memories of her that we are creating here today. As so many people have already said, in this time of intense grief and loss, we have all found solace in the incredible relationships that Mala sustained around the world. I am so grateful for this transnational community that Mala has created through her truly remarkable ability to forge such extensive, deep, and lasting friendships and collaborations. She was and is so beloved by many, as today has shown. This photograph, taken by Heather Evans, is of Mala and me doing fieldwork in Rio Negro, Guatemala in August 2017. This is how I like to think of her now, in the beauty of nature with her beloved birds. This photograph also speaks to our work together. When it was taken, we were following the path of a series of horrific massacres of the Rio Negro community that took place between 1980 and 1982. As we took that memorial walk, led by massacre survivor Sebastián Iboy Osorio, and accompanied by Heather, Irma Alicia Velasquez, and Brenton Likes, we encountered or were haunted by, in Mala's words, and I quote, an unsettling dissonance between the serene beauty of the present and the ugly atrocities it masks. Our visit to Rio Negro was part of our decade-long collaboration on the inhabitants of loss, on how to build, again in Mala's words, a political community of the sorrowing in the aftermath of violence. We have followed many such paths together, most recently in our work with Sharzad Mojab, Honor Ford Smith, Carmela Madalka, and Heather Evans to create a network of feminist scholars, artists, activists, and curators from myriad spaces and places who have come together to explore the transnational dimensions of how we collectively remember and memorialize violence, the website for which you were seeing just now. We have been friends for over 25 years, since we met through the Women in Conflict Zone Network in 1995, when we were both graduate students. I am so grateful to Winona Giles, Maya Korach, Jennifer Hyman, and so many others for creating that space, which fostered so many deep friendships and research collaborations, including mine with Mala. I miss her terribly. I miss her already. I miss her quiet, incomparable brilliance. I miss her fierce, abounding outrage at injustice. I miss her deep empathy and concern and care for others. I miss the companionable silences of long days on the road together. I miss her mischievous, teasing grin. I miss her discerning palate, her telling me in no uncertain terms what I must eat. I miss her steadfast friendship. She is the voice in my head. She is with me when I swim, our mutual passion, or more accurately, obsession. She is with me when I eat good food, but I do love cilantro. I'm sorry, Mala. She is with me when I read a great book that I think I must share with her. She is with me when I laugh at a funny meme that I immediately want to send to her. She is with us as we continue to build transnational feminist community in the memorialization of loss and violence, and as we struggle to reckon with the heart-rending reality of memorializing and honoring her and her work. She is the voice in my head, the beloved absent presence whose traces will continue to mark us all. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. We'll hear next from Udayani Navaratnam, former student at South Asian University and a research assistant with Mala.
Hello, everyone. I am speaking from Jaffna. Mala, my lecturer, friend, consultant, and mentor to me. When I studied in the Diploma in Women's Study program at the Colombo University, she was the lecturer to me. With that introduction, she appointed me as a research assistant in the northern province of Sri Lanka for some researchers. I like to specially indicate 3 of those works. First one is the research on gender and governance perspective from South Asia. That research focuses on the structures of governance as they impact women in 5 complete zones in South Asia. She contributed to the research on gender and governance in post-war northern Sri Lanka. Second one, living with uncertainty, needs of the families of missing persons in Sri Lanka. The purpose of the research was the carrying out a need assessment of the disappearance family for ICRC. Third one, invoking the goddess Patini Kannahayaman photo exhibition. In the research on gender and governance in post-war northern Sri Lanka, she analyzed gender in the political, socio-economical, and security situation in the northern province. She mainly focused on how Sri Lankan war influenced women's lives in various ways, and militarization and violence against women and its constituents, lack of social infrastructure and commercial infrastructure in the war affected areas women's daily life, women and war-related memories, especially women demanding the right to memorialization, women in politics and governance. She focused on elected as well as the appointed post within the northern province. And she focused on women in civil societies, especially women's struggle and resistance as part of women organization, forum, as women human rights defenders. Although I lived throughout the conflict in the war zone, sometimes I tend to normalize war-related issues such as displacement and loss of property. Through that research, I realized that I also faced war-related issues. During the research period, I had the opportunity to visit various parts of the northern province because during the wartime, the A9 road, which connects Jaffna to other part of Sri Lanka, was closed, and there were restrictions to mobility. I had no chance to visit other part in the northern province, especially Mullaitivu and Mannar. I went to these places for the first time with her to research. For her research, she used the normal interview methodologies as well as the poems and traditional drama. I like to share an experience in one of the field visits. We went to Mullaitivu to view Kovalan Kuthu, which is a kind of traditional drama performance throughout the night. At the time, she casually spoke to viewers of that performance. How did they come from distant places before the war to see this performance, and with whom they came? In general, before the war, women came to the performance with their family and extended family members, and they started about their loss of some extended family members. Through this kind of discussion, she got more rich information. Another experience that I had when she used a poem in a newspaper on the temple festival page, indicating getting support from the god to find solution for the war-related issue, such as disappearance and lost family members. Those methodologies she used were new to me. I learned a lot through her research. When we visited for the personal interview, she had a habit of giving a small gift to the respondent for their valuable time and contribution. She liked certain Jaffna foods such as puttu, point pitto vadai, and idare banana. She preferred to find those food during her Jaffna visit. Beyond the research purpose, she would casually discuss various other things with me on the political situation, women issues, climate change, and about corona and issues faced by women in Jaffna. Thank you.
Thank you, Udayani. Next, we'll hear from Nilanthi Chandaratna, another former student of Mala.
I will start off with a Facebook message that I posted in appreciation of Dr. Malathi. It was posted before she went to live with the stars. There are so many things my heart wants to say to you, all of which are summed up in these two haikus. First one, even with insects, some can sing, some can't, written by Isa, translated by Robert Hess. I think about this haiku because being a student of yours was one of the greatest things that ever happened to this insect. Secondly, it's a Sinhala one, written by Nandana Veerasinghe. Me pura handata thana patat mahagirat kiya venasak neti heti. Meaning, alas, this full moon is amazing, for it sheds light equally upon the huge mountain and the little blade of grass. In fact, Dr. Malathi was able to sing with us, small and insignificant people like me. She slowly lifted us up and showed that the sky was the limit. The Ring of Eight is how Dr. Malathi Nivas, Savini, Bimali, Shra, Shadi, Kartiha, Nelly, Kavita, and I. The 8 students in the Gender and Women's Studies course at the University of Colombo were from different walks of life. There were 2, including me, who had an upbringing away from the main city, compared to the rest of Colombo-based families. She's the strong thread which ties the ring into a bunch. Yes, the use of present tense here is not a mistake. She had a gentle but radiant charisma. It is amazing how Dr. Malathi carefully pushed us through to get the best of each and everyone's capacities. Emotional nourishment in combination with plenty of scolding, chasing us to the libraries, not forgetting to follow up on the completion of tasks given, and getting us to read until we got the main arguments. For an example, I had to read Bambi Chapin's book on a childhood in a Sri Lankan village 4 times until I was able to have a good grasp of the arguments. This eventually became one of my key texts of my MA thesis. I am forever indebted to her for forcing me to do in-depth reading of phenomenology with regards to my academic work. I was asked to read Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception and try to incorporate some of the concepts of phenomenology into the mini research done during our postgraduate course. Initially, I was so annoyed thinking why she was forcing this on me. I could not grasp a wee bit of it. To cut a long story short, the reading of phenomenology took me so far that it became the overarching conceptual framework of my thesis. It was a process. It didn't happen overnight, but she pushed me through patiently towards understanding more complex concepts. Like a mother to her small kid, she would proudly and loudly say, "Here, I'm expert in phenomenology." I would never forget those words of reassurance that made a difference in the way I now think about myself as a whole. Dr. Malathi and the Ring of Eight have our own memories to reach back to. Lunching together at her place on Elibank Road, walking us from room to room in her apartment, giving us the task of grasping the meanings, concepts, interpretations of some paintings that she had hung on her walls, traveling together to a wedding of one of the Ring of Eight, and planning a gala meetup after everyone has submitted the thesis, probably in coming April or May. She touched hearts across all levels. While traveling to the wedding, 40 odd kilometers, my son, 11-year-old, made a long-lasting friendship with her. He used to correspond through voice messages with her, and she used to send books to my son when I visited her. The Ring of Eight wanted our children also to have been walking with her, to have felt the deep down warmth in her, to have grown up under her large wings. She always touched lives in a meaningful way, even the people she randomly met. My husband was one such. He met her only once or twice, but the impact is extensive. He took attempts to read her work, worrying, complaining about how the leftists in Sri Lanka have missed her, like how they missed Kumari Jayawardena. His last Christmas message to her was a song of Luciano Pavarotti. They both are fans of Pavarotti. He ordered a set of books of Gananath Obesekar and is reading them at present. Dr. Malathi's memory is everywhere at my house. She exists in the books given to us by her or books of other scholars that we bought with her influence. We have kept them in our sight. Dr. Malathi would have never known how much she was a topic in our family discussions. My in-laws, my mother, and my sister-in-law, they all have a lot of respect towards her for the reason that they saw my academic transformation through Dr. Malathi. Finally, I would like to share this too with you. I finished my Viva just 10 days after the demise of our dear Dr. Malathi. I dropped a message to her phone before going to Viva, knowing that she was no more to encourage me. Maybe it looked silly, but that was how I plucked courage. Thank you.
Thanks, Nilante. Our next speaker is Ridibata Saha, also a student of Mala from India.
Yeah, I hope I'm audible. In a talk that Mala had delivered on the topic trauma, memory, and forgetting, she notes the importance of memorial in all societies, recognizing them as repositories of memory, suffering, and grief. She believed that they often help to translate the unthinkable to the thinkable. This is my attempt to do justice to her observation. If I was asked when I first read Malathi de Alwis, I'll not be able to recall. But I do remember specific moments of mentally citing her in conversation with friends, arguments with oppositions, reading the news, but mostly while taking a long, good look at what I am doing as a woman, as a feminist, as an activist, and as an aspiring researcher. I will try to put to words how reading Malathi has been a continuous process with varied interpretations at different points of time. As a student who is very interested in the study of violence, intertwined with the biography of being a woman, a gendered body upon which unintelligible forms of violence are inflicted, reading Malathi feels like an extremely personal and yet explosively political thing to do. Malathi has been a commentator of not only state-sponsored violence, militaristic violence in Sri Lanka, but she's also raises important questions about the very nature of states' regulation against and the delineation of violence in the formation of citizens' identities. Simply put, Malathi opens up, drawing from the visible and the invisible forms of violence, the need to question and critique the very form of nation states. One of the many ways in which Malathi does that is through a deep look at how gender and sexuality is approached by the nation states. One comes across multiple instances where the sexual is sanitized, reified, if not completely obliterated from the narrative of nation state formation and the identity formation of its citizens. To this end, Malathi has been beyond just an academician or a theorist anthropologist to be read. She has spoken to her through her text to me as a comrade, as somebody who fights beside me at every step of the way to resist statist interventions to whitewash my body to fit its own nationalistic fervor. In that regard, Malathi has influenced my activism as well. As a university-going South Asian woman studying sociology, every day and everyday life is a choice between what Malathi refers to as strategies of refusal and strategies of request. My university life began in 2014, and so did my engagement with first-hand political activism and protests. At every point, the choice became increasingly glaring. Somebody once told me, you can't study anthropology and sociology and be an activist at the same time. Activism rests on a black and white world. It was very disheartening to hear that. This is where mental citations come along. Malathi had said somewhere that every plan of action is a negotiation. And this was also along the time where I started reading about strategic essentialism. And I realized this can be applied in many different flavors. Moreover, Malathi's engagement and involvement with Butler also came in as a relief during these moments of self-doubt. For the longest time, unable to find a proper term for my ideology and unable to find a proper, tangible, universal enemy to fight against, I resorted to what Butler calls issue-specific, loosely overlapping solidarities to refer to my politics. But this was still the disturbance of not being able to state feminism as my foremost ideological and political dominator became too much to bear. Malathi throws light, like a light that never goes out, on issues of feminism and the issues that feminism faces. And it is at this point of Malathi's intervention that I started looking up to her as a researcher and academician above all, because of her keen eye for methodological challenges that women face in carrying out both activism and academics. Watertight categories like the social, the political, the field for Malathi are exactly the ones that need to be pulled apart bit by bit before we use them as conceptual categories. How can feminism as a project, as an idea, much like our research projects and research ideas, be undertaken without a thorough questioning of the very categories that govern them? Often, both projects tend to lose sight of their scope and their responsibility in the face of external funding, professionalism, institutionalism, etc. Malathi points that this codification, although it brings out a sense of stability in the work, often discourages critical thinking and takes these categories, specifically project-based categories and also with disciplines at large, to be unproblematically applicable to any circumstances. In that sense, Malathi's biggest influence on me has been this: the acceptance that the political is something that nobody can escape, irrespective of who I look at myself as a student, as a researcher, as a woman. I must not suppress any part of myself. This is that what others regard as political enough or not, academic enough or not, painful enough or not, must not hinder me. I must devise myself and my work to speak to the world, not just because it is relevant, but simply because I cannot and must not escape the political that is undeniably tattooed upon my being and my birth. Memory, I read, was of deep interest to Malathi, and I shared none with her. Perhaps she would have appreciated the relief that I feel from not having to bear any lingering memory of her. Memory is something that occurs at the crossroads of pain and joy of remembering and the fear of forgetting. Somehow, Malathi's passing doesn't hit me that way. It is both a blessing and a curse. Blessing because, like the grammar of the piece that I just read, Malathi will continue to exist in present tense. Curse because I will never grow or grow enough to make acquaintance with her, become her friend, or at the very least, raise fists with her in the air in camaraderie and in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Riddhi Brada. Next, we'll hear from Carol Tozer, also a friend of Mala.
Hi. So ever since Sonali introduced Malathi to me, Malathi has been very supportive, fiercely protective, and a loyal friend. Mala pushed me to be a better photographer. She'd encourage me to take the photos that I thought were insignificant and insist they were beautiful photos yet to be taken. She could see the same bird 100 times and still be enthralled. I'd say, oh, there's an orange thrush. She would chime in and say, a northern orange-headed thrush. She taught me so much. I used to think of myself as a reluctant birder, but after years spent with Mala, she would say, reluctant no more. Whenever we traveled overseas, we would bring back gifts for each other. A green shawl, a jungle print shawl she brought me for those cold mornings. Sewn puppy to eat, she knew I loved the feel of candy floss. A beautifully sewn and embroidered blouse from Colombia, which Mala thought suited me well, but was actually better on a younger girl. When free of papers to write, remarks to ink, and students to mentor, Mala would call up asking, can we escape to the jungle? Her favorite thing to do. She would plan the meals for our trip to the wilderness, a meticulously planned handwritten menu handed to the cook on arrival at the bungalow. The last mornings were always kiripat, that is milk rice with scrambled egg and onion sambal. I would grumble every time and I'd say, who on earth eats scrambled egg with milk rice, Mala? And by the way, it's katta sambal with milk rice, not onion sambal. And she'd say, why? Oh, this is so lovely. Even in the jungle, her menu would consist on shrimp and garlic bread, or she would go into the kitchen and make pumpkin soup. Picture that in a rustic bungalow with no electricity, just a few solar-powered lights. One time we were sitting in the jungle, caught in a squall and eating son papdi. Huge bear comes out of the clearing in search of ants, rain pouring. And rain pouring, it was oblivious to us. Or once betting on the outcome while we watched a painted stork try to swallow a fish. Sorry, I'm trying to get the screen up. Yes. So am I sharing the screen? Sorry. Okay. So rain pouring, it was oblivious to us. A huge bear came out of the clearing in search of ants. While we once betting on the outcome, while we watched a painted stork try to swallow a fish with a crocodile circling it, however, this stork had somehow got his mandible through the fish, or so we noticed later on. Oh, poor bird, we sighed. Sometimes on camping trips, she would suddenly decide we would sneak off and explore the jungle on foot, striding through without a sideways glance. Once I was looking around to see if any creature was lurking around when a sudden bark made me grab her arm. Ayo, that's just a barking deer, she said, while I was bent on telling her off for not being aware of her surroundings and what trouble she got us into. Then again, it was pretty silly of me, as of course, she was plugged into her jungle sense. Some of our conversations went like this. Mala, there is a beehive close by. Me in disbelief, what nonsense? Don't tell me you can hear bees now. And she would smile with a glint in her eyes and say, of course we could. Of course I could. I had to challenge that, but we take a few strides and of course we ran into bees buzzing around. Mala had acute hearing. In the night, she'd wake up and say, can you hear the leopard? What leopard, I'd say. And then yes, sure enough, I'd hear a distant leopard. Or one night we heard 3 different owl calls and she'd rattle off which calls belong to which species of owl. Of course, Mala came up with some harebrained schemes at times and I would just go along with it and say yes. Like the time she wanted me to drive to Anavilundava, that was 3 hours away, or 2.5 hours down to Kiralakale, just to see what migratory birds had arrived there, and then in turn around and drive back to Colombo. Always armed with a box of sandwiches, fruit, and flask of coffee, she would bring her own tea made just the way she preferred it, with powdered milk. I'd go, yuck, powdered milk? And she'd then wax poetic about how wonderful that tasted. Then, of course, there's the day she said, can you drive? Let's go to Wilpattu for a quick turnaround to see the black-capped kingfisher. She said, one migrant bird has arrived in Wilpattu. It's just the most beautiful. You have to see it. So we left Colombo at 4 in the morning, got to Nelunville at 7:30, sat in the vehicle until 4:30 when the bird finally showed up. What patience she taught us. And as promised, it was the most beautiful bird. I would tell her stories of my sixth sense and intuition. She never scoffed at that. Last year in July, Mala went with us to Galloya. She spotted a racket-tailed drongo for my collection, one previously not photographed by me. We hiked for hours looking for a blue-eared kingfisher. While in Galloya, she had both knees bandaged and oiled and yet climbed the makara, which is quite difficult to do, with me giving her a hand to jump or squeeze through boulders to get to the top, where we would watch elephants bathing in the Senanayaka Samudra, utter bliss. Galloya was somewhere she absolutely had to go, she said, having missed our previous trip due to typhoid. Again, in the end of July, we then went camping in Kumala, where she asked me if she could bring her niece Shamani, apologizing for not sharing the tent with me as she was as usual. We saw a personal record of 10.5 leopard. The half, she said, was the cub. We also went camping to Yala at the end of August. She said, how about you bring your 2 sisters, I will bring my 2 sisters, and we will be 2 sets of 3 sisters. She wanted to spend time in the jungle with her sisters. Mala may have had her own sixth sense and intuition. She was saying her goodbyes. The day Mala left us, I walked into the sunny garden devastated.
I'm gonna make us an English muffin with avocado.
Butterfly dropped down on my head for a fleeting moment. It was similar to a butterfly we were in search of last year in Galloya. It is endemic to that area and not seen in Colombo. The next day, a black hooded oriole landed on a branch at my eye level. I could have reached out and touched it. It called a couple of times and took off. In that moment, I thought, where were these messages from my dear friend? Was she reminding me of the time we went to the Western Ghats, sat in a treehouse in Lonavella for hours, watching the golden orioles? Soon after we lost her, I received an invite from an environmental activist I had only been in touch with via SMS, inviting me to Vilpattu. How did she know that my jungle buddy was no more and that I had no good group to go with? I'm sure Mala arranged it. It was a difficult time not having her there. I went to Mala's favorite waterhole where I saw such an unusual scene of a tender interaction between two elephants. I almost felt comforted. As much as she loved life, Mars hated certain things: papaya, raisins in cooked food, but she of course happily eat raisins in cakes, despised cilantro. She was an academic and activist, having her papers or books published, while I was an activist trying to save the world from a practical approach, hands-on. We would bicker at times like Matt and Jeff, yet we had so much in common. We were the proverbial yin and yang. Since we always chased kingfishers, I want to leave you with this beautiful poem, The Kingfisher by W.H. Davis. It was the rainbow gave thee birth and left thee all her lovely hues. And as her mother's name was Tears, so runs it in my blood to choose. For haunts the lonely pools and keep in company with trees that weep. Go you and with such glorious hues, live with proud peacocks in green parks. On lawns as smooth as shining glass, let every feather show its mark. Get thee on boughs and clap thy wings before the windows of proud kings. Nay, lovely bird, thou art not vain. Thou hast no proud, ambitious mind. I also love a quiet place that's green, away from all mankind, a lonely pool, and let a tree sigh with her bosom over me. Thank you.
Thank you, Karel. Our last speaker will be Pradeep Jagannathan, anthropologist, writer, and Mala's husband.
Hello. Can I be seen?
Yes.
You can be seen, Pradeep. You're partly shadowed, but you can be seen.
Okay. First of all, on behalf of Malathi's family, my deep appreciation to the organizing group, Nivi, Mary, Riti, and Vasuki. Thank you for the countless hours spending organizing this wonderful event, and I value deeply all those who spoke and contributed. Malathi's last months were difficult and very painful for her because she did not wish to have a long wake. Perhaps a good thing in these virus-ridden times, but then which did not allow us to thank so many of the people who helped those of us during that time. I would like to do so today. The numbers are large and I ask forgiveness if I miss a name. But Karel, who just spoke, and Dilki, who is not here, were constantly with us, bringing love, care, food, and many things we needed. Rai, Amila, Jay, Dushi, and Hasna bought many things like food and beverages. Anu gave us an extra bed, and when the can was stored, Dilki gave us another. Karel bought her so many things and was there with me when we got Mala a new mechanical bed. Sean cut her hair. Her cousin Manori brought delicacies. My aunt Vasanti and my cousin Mano made countless lunches and dinners. I thank all the folk in my Friday group who sent food and love. Nimisha and Foni, Harsha and Devyani, Geetaka and Ruani, Hira and Priyan, Bimalka and Janaka, Kaya and Vish, Ashan and Michelle. Amila and her colleagues did a little book of memories for Mala, and she enjoyed us reading to her from it, even though I couldn't read much of it aloud. So many others sent messages, and in the final days were with us electronically. Malathi would watch me type and say every so often, add so and so to the group. She wanted her loved ones with her. I would also like to recall her nurses and attendants, Dilrukshia, home attendants, Sugandhi and Pratibha, her ICU nurses. Her physicians, Anuka and Ruani, were at her bedside at home at all hours, and then in hospital, where Ruani did everything and more to care for her. I recall the love my mother and her parents kept sending, for they could not visit, not being that mobile anymore, and the constant visits of her nieces and nephews, Sanuri and Shaheen, Shamani, and Revanka and Ashika. Shani did so much in her own way to try to make Mala better. My brothers-in-law, Rohan and Chandana, always stepped in with intricate logistical assistance as needed. It is with deep appreciation that I recall the incredible labor of love and the enormous courage with which her sisters, Swendridi and Nilanthi, cared for, giving her medication, read to her day and night at home and in hospital, even when we knew the end was upon us. It was all a great strength to me in the most difficult time of my life ever. I met Malathi in 1986 in Colombo when she was working on a documentary film and I a script for a teleseries. I was writing a bit of fiction then, and Mala and I had a kind of aesthetic in common. Even though I had little sense of the visual, she did have a nuanced sense of text. I was drawn to that, for I was basically a math nerd, taking it as a writer. I had taken a year off MIT, trying to get to the other side of engineering, and she was on her way back to the US to graduate school in anthropology, which I was already dipping into. We got married in Colombo in August '89, when we were both young graduate students in anthropology at Chicago. Ours was a long, passionate at times, fraught at times, incredibly intimate and difficult relationship. As she put it on her deathbed, we fought so much, separated so many times, but we could never stay away from each other. I love you so much. As more than one person remarked on more than one occasion long years ago, if they are separated, why do they spend so much time together? I suppose time did tell, and we taught each other what love meant to us both. As we grew to be teachers, we realized that we were each other's first students, for we taught each other so much. When I first took to photography seriously, it was Mala who lent me her amazing eye for light and composition, and Carol just shared her own memories of that. And in those difficult early years in Chicago, an amazingly rigorous and competitive cold place to figure out what anthropology meant to us, which Riti spoke about too. We would read together, debate ideas endlessly, and teach each other. As Jean Komarov said in a letter to me after she passed, Malathi was part of a brilliant cohort of students who have taken anthropology to new places by taking it home and decolonizing it. As many who spoke before me have pointed out, she intertwined three great intellectual traditions: Asian studies, anthropology, and feminism, and politicized the resultant with breathtaking tenacity, astuteness, and delicacy. But she also embodied another tradition, that of humanism, friendship, and fraternal love that so many have spoken to today. She loved all things, not simply humans. Malathi's intimate attachment to the flora and fauna of the world was developed in Sri Lanka's great wildlife parks under the guidance of her paternal uncle Lin, the renowned zoologist and ecologist. She knew every bird she saw, every tree, every leaf. She started young, immersed in detail of love, life, and death that Sonali, who has given me much strength in the last weeks, captured so well in her contribution earlier. Her nature diary begins in 1977 when she was 13 and a half, with a set of acute, detailed observations about her home garden in Colombo. It is a large space with many trees. It is as if she was doing fieldwork, even then, with all the skill of a mature anthropologist. Here in the garden, she discovers, towards the back of the house, very near Manika's room, we've heard of Manika, towards the back of a house, a nest of bulbuls where eggs were being hatched. However, a couple of quails were trying, as is their way, to attack the nest and get at the eggs. On the 5th of May, 1977, she writes, After so many days of combined efforts to chase the quails, we have been defeated. That's she and Manika. The eggs were gone. The entry for the next day reads, "Today I was forced to face reality. My two little friends, the bulbuls, will not greet me anymore with their soft coos, nor will I be able to share again that great, awesome, as well as serene and sacred feeling that overpowers me when I watched my little friend seated on her eggs. I removed the nest, that warm, cozy cup that would have sheltered 3 newborn little nestlings. As the darkness closed like a shroud upon me, I sat on the garden seat." When Malathi's ashes meet the soil of Lanka and become one with the earth, new life, weeds, grass, flowers, bees, and birds will be nourished. Just as the words and images shared today meet our speakers and screens, only to slowly fade away and die, they will give new life to fraternal bonds and inspire and catalyze work in which she will always live. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep, for sharing that with us. We have a final video to take us out. So I ask you once again to opt for the hide video panel at the top of your Zoom. And perhaps a final reminder to everyone to just keep yourselves muted for now. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. Before we leave, we request that everyone turn their videos on for a minute, especially the speakers and others, so we can all have a sense of how coming together in this in our communities, even while we grieve. Thank you.
Mary here. Just, I have nothing to say now. Thank you all who have been with us in this program that was made possible only by all of you. You are the community now, and you are Mala collectively, together, for her family, for her friends, for all who now will carry Mala forward. I have been, I think, especially blessed in being part of this process. I was not a close friend of Mala's, but thanks to all of you, I feel she was my friend too. We hope that this will come together in the form of a YouTube video we've been recording throughout. We'll need to edit it somewhat. Bear with us, and perhaps on Mala's Facebook, you will see a link shortly. Give us a few days that can be more widely shared or relived in whatever way you like. So thank you all. Good day, good night, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh.
Yeah, Lanka over there. The county. Go.
Thank you, Riti and Vasuki.
Thanks, Vasuki. Thanks, Riti. Thanks, all the organizers. That was really special. Thank you. Hey, good to see you, Riti.
Yeah.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, who's that?
Sonali.
Hi, Sonali.
Hey.
Look us up when you come to New York, Digga. Look us up when you come to New York.
Oh yeah, I know. I wish, I just not allowed. If not, wow, that was intense. It was beautiful, though. Thanks so much for organizing. It was so lovely.
Thanks to you and to everybody that spoke.
God, no, it was really special. Even she would have approved, no?
I think so.
Just about. I think we would have got a few scoldings, but I think
about this.
Might have had things to say about flow and layout and.
I know. God,
thank you.
Horrible photos and what nonsense.